Today, May 6, 2026, the eyes of the world should be fixed on Moscow, where at 1100 hours local time, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stood behind a lectern flanked by the flags of the Russian Federation, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and announced the signing of a bilateral non-aggression and economic cooperation framework between Tehran and Riyadh, brokered, guaranteed, and underwritten entirely by Russia. On the surface, it looks like a diplomatic triumph, a historic handshake between two nations that have waged proxy wars across the Middle East for 4 decades, a step toward regional stability that should be welcomed by every capital with an interest in preventing a catastrophic Gulf conflict. But is this truly a peace deal, or is it the most sophisticated strategic trap laid for American influence in the Middle East since the Soviet Union collapsed 35 years ago? Let that question settle for a moment, because the answer to it determines not just the future of the Gulf, not just the future of American foreign policy in the Middle East, but the future of the entire architecture of alliances, energy partnerships, and security guarantees that Washington has spent half a century building, an architecture that, as of this morning, has a Russian knife pressed quietly against its throat. What exactly did Russia offer Tehran and Riyadh that the United States could not? Why did Saudi Arabia, America's most important Arab security partner, agree to a framework brokered by a nation currently under Western sanctions for its invasion of Ukraine? What are the hidden clauses in this agreement that neither Lavrov nor the Saudi and Iranian foreign ministers mentioned at the podium? And what happens to the $50 billion a year American military presence in the Gulf when the two nations it was designed to keep apart decide they no longer need American protection from each other? Stay with us, because the answers are more consequential than anything you have heard from the official channels. If you want raw, no-nonsense analysis that dismantles the press conference language and exposes the strategic machinery underneath, hit the like button right now, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is the kind of deal that reshapes the world. To understand how Moscow pulled this off, you have to understand what Washington failed to do. The idea of an Iran-Saudi rapprochement is not new. China brokered a preliminary agreement between Tehran and Riyadh in March 2023, a deal that was announced with fanfare, covered breathlessly by international media, and then allowed to quietly disintegrate over the following 18 months as neither side demonstrated the political will to implement its terms. The Chinese deal restored diplomatic relations on paper, but changed nothing on the ground. Iranian-backed Houthi forces continued to strike Saudi and Emirati interests from Yemen. Iranian proxies in Iraq continued to threaten Gulf energy infrastructure. And Saudi Arabia continued to seek American weapon systems designed explicitly for use against Iranian military capabilities. The deal was a photograph. It was not a policy. Washington watched the Chinese broker deal collapse and drew the wrong conclusion. The State Department concluded that Iran-Saudi reconciliation was structurally impossible given the depth of the sectarian, strategic, and proxy war divisions between the two nations, and that any external broker would eventually discover what the United States had long believed, that the Iran-Saudi rivalry is a permanent feature of the Middle East, not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be managed, and that the management of that condition required permanent American military presence in the Gulf as the guarantor of Saudi security and the deterrent against Iranian aggression. This conclusion was comfortable. It was self-serving. It confirmed every institutional assumption that justified $50 billion a year in Gulf military spending, and it was catastrophically wrong. The Americans assumed that no one else could broker the deal because no one else had the leverage. What they failed to see was that leverage in the Middle East is not a fixed quantity. It is manufactured. And while Washington was consumed with the Fitzgerald engagement and the multi-domain pressure campaign against Iran, while the State Department's attention was locked on carrier deployments and sanctions enforcement and Fad battery placements. Russian diplomats were conducting shuttle diplomacy between Tehran and Riyadh at a pace and intensity that American intelligence monitored, but according to assessments being discussed in policy circles, fundamentally misread. The CIA's Middle East analysts reportedly assessed the Russian diplomatic activity as performative, an attempt by Moscow to appear relevant in a region where its military presence is minimal. They categorized it as diplomatic theater. It was not theater. It was architecture, assembled beam by beam over 6 months of back-channel negotiations that neither Tehran nor Riyadh reported to their American interlocutors. What Washington missed, and what Moscow exploited with the precision of a surgeon operating on a patient who did not know they were on the table, was that the conditions that made the Chinese deal fail were not permanent structural barriers. They were leverage points that could be manipulated by a broker willing to offer things that China could not and the United States would not. Russia brought 3 assets to the table that no other potential broker possessed. The first asset was military leverage over Iran. Russia is Iran's primary supplier of advanced military hardware, including the Su-35 Flanker-E air superiority fighter, a twin-engine super-maneuverable aircraft capable of carrying a combat load of 8,000 kilograms across a range of 3,600 kilometers, with a phased array radar system that can track 30 targets simultaneously and engage 8. Russia has also supplied Iran with components for its S-300 PMU-2 air defense system, the backbone of Iran's long-range air defense network, and has been in negotiations regarding the more advanced S-400 Triumph system, which can engage targets at ranges up to 400 kilometers and track up to 300 targets simultaneously. This supply relationship gives Moscow a form of leverage over Tehran that no other external actor possesses: the ability to condition future military deliveries on Iranian compliance with diplomatic commitments. China supplies Iran with economic goods. The United States supplies Iran with nothing but sanctions. Only Russia supplies Iran with the weapons that Tehran considers essential to its survival, and only Russia can credibly threaten to withhold them. The second asset was energy coordination. Russia and Saudi Arabia are the 2 largest oil exporters in the world, and their coordination within the OPEC Plus framework has been the single most important factor in global oil price management since 2016. This gives Russia a permanent seat at the table of Saudi strategic decision-making that the United States, which is simultaneously a competitor in the global oil market and a critic of OPEC production decisions, cannot match. Moscow did not approach Riyadh as a neutral mediator. Moscow approached Riyadh as a business partner with a shared interest in maintaining oil prices above $80 per barrel, and framed the Iran-Saudi deal as a mechanism to reduce the geopolitical risk premium that depresses long-term investment in Gulf oil infrastructure. The message to Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was not about peace for its own sake. It was about money. Stability in the Gulf means higher sustained oil prices, more predictable investment returns, and a more favorable environment for the economic diversification programs that the Crown Prince has staked his domestic legitimacy on. Russia spoke Saudi Arabia's language, not the language of diplomacy, but the language of revenue per barrel. The third asset was the most devastating of all, and it is the one that Washington is only now beginning to comprehend. Russia offered Saudi Arabia something that the United States has spent 50 years refusing to provide: a security guarantee that is not conditioned on Saudi human rights performance, not subject to congressional review, not dependent on the outcome of American elections, and not accompanied by lectures about democratic reform, women's rights, or press freedom. The Russian security framework, according to the terms reportedly being analyzed in diplomatic channels, commits Moscow to providing Saudi Arabia with advanced air defense systems, intelligence sharing on regional threats, and a mutual defense consultation mechanism that activates in the event of an attack on Saudi territory or critical infrastructure. In exchange, Saudi Arabia reportedly commits to maintaining oil production coordination with Russia through OPEC+, to refraining from joining any Western sanctions regime directed at Russia, and to recognizing Russia's legitimate security interests in the Middle East and beyond. Language that diplomatic analysts interpret as an implicit Saudi acceptance of Russia's position in Ukraine. The implications of this three-legged structure, military leverage over Iran, energy partnership with Saudi Arabia, and an unconditional security guarantee, are staggering in their breadth. Let each one sink in, because together they represent the most significant realignment of Middle Eastern alliances since the Camp David Accords of 1978. The deal's first layer is the non-aggression framework itself. Iran and Saudi Arabia reportedly commit to ceasing support for proxy forces operating against the other's interests, establishing a joint maritime communication channel for the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea to prevent naval incidents, opening direct flights and trade corridors between Tehran and Riyadh for the first time in over 7 years, and creating a joint commission with Russian participation to monitor compliance and adjudicate disputes. The proxy clause is the most significant. If implemented, it would require Iran to curtail Houthi operations against Saudi targets in Yemen and the Red Sea, and require Saudi Arabia to reduce support for Iranian opposition groups, including the Mujahideen Khalq and Baluch separatist movements operating from Gulf-funded media platforms. If implemented, that conditional carries the weight of 4 decades of broken promises and the full complexity of proxy networks that have developed their own institutional momentum independent of their state sponsors. The second layer is energy. The deal reportedly includes a joint Russian, Iranian, Saudi energy coordination mechanism that would expand OPEC+ into a de facto energy management alliance with the power to set global oil prices at levels that suit its members' fiscal requirements. The numbers involved are vertigo-inducing. Russia produces approximately 10.5 million barrels of crude per day. Saudi Arabia produces between 9 and 10 million. Iran, if sanctions enforcement is relaxed as the deal's economic provisions reportedly envision, could ramp production from its current estimated 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day back toward its pre-sanctions capacity of roughly 4 million. Together, the three nations would control approximately 24 million barrels per day, roughly a quarter of global production. If this mechanism functions as described, it would represent the first time in history that the world's 3 largest oil producers have operated under a single coordinated framework, a cartel within a cartel, a price-setting engine with the power to determine whether the global economy grows or contracts based on decisions made in Moscow, Tehran, and Riyadh rather than in Washington or Brussels. The dollar per barrel implications alone could add or subtract hundreds of billions of dollars from the global economy annually. The third layer is security architecture, and it is here that the true genius or the true danger of the Russian design becomes visible. Russia positions itself as the region's new security guarantor, not by deploying carrier groups or building bases in the traditional American model, but by offering what amounts to a diplomatic and arms supply framework backed by energy coordination and intelligence sharing. Moscow does not need to project military power into the Gulf the way the United States does. It needs only to be the indispensable broker, the nation without which the deal collapses, the partner that both sides need more than they need Washington. The cost to Russia is minimal. Diplomatic bandwidth and arms deliveries it was already making. The return is enormous, a seat at the center of Middle Eastern security for the first time since the Soviet Union lost its regional influence in the late 1970s. In Washington, the reaction has been one of institutional shock layered over bureaucratic paralysis. The State Department issued a statement welcoming any steps toward regional stability, while noting that the United States remains committed to its security partnerships in the Gulf. Language so formulaic that it could have been generated by a template. Behind the statement, according to reporting from diplomatic sources, the reality is far more chaotic. The National Security Council convened an emergency deputies meeting within 3 hours of Lavrov's announcement. The CIA's Middle East Directorate has reportedly been tasked with producing an urgent assessment of the deal's intelligence implications, particularly the intelligence sharing provisions that could give Russia access to Saudi surveillance capabilities that were provided by the United States under bilateral defense agreements. The Pentagon Central Command is reportedly conducting a review of all bilateral military cooperation agreements with Saudi Arabia to determine which ones are affected by the Russian security guarantee and whether any American-provided weapon systems or defense technologies are at risk of being shared with Moscow under the new framework. In Beijing, the reaction has been measured but unmistakably frustrated. China considered itself the natural broker of Iran-Saudi reconciliation after the 2023 deal, and Russia's success where China failed represents a significant loss of diplomatic prestige. More importantly, the Energy Coordination Mechanism threatens Chinese interests by giving Russia and its partners greater control over the oil prices that directly affect China's manufacturing costs. Beijing has reportedly communicated through diplomatic channels that it expects to be included in any expanded energy coordination framework, a demand that Moscow has so far declined to address. In Tehran, the mood is one of cautious vindication. Iran has spent years seeking an exit from the diplomatic isolation imposed by American sanctions, and the Russian-brokered deal provides one, not through submission to Western demands, but through alignment with an alternative power structure that does not require Iran to dismantle its nuclear program, abandon its proxy networks, or accept a humiliation of American-dictated terms. The deal gives Iran what it has wanted for decades: regional recognition as a legitimate power, an economic lifeline through normalized trade with Saudi Arabia, and a security framework that reduces the threat of a joint American-Saudi military campaign against Iranian territory. The price, curtailing proxy operations and accepting Russian oversight of its compliance, is one that significant factions within the Iranian establishment reportedly consider acceptable, though hardline elements within the IRGC have expressed reservations about any commitment that constrains Iran's ability to project power through its network of allied militias. Across the Gulf states, the reaction has split along lines that reveal just how deeply the Russian deal has fractured the existing alliance structure. The UAE, which has maintained its own quiet diplomatic channel with Moscow and has resisted American pressure to condemn the Ukraine invasion, is reportedly exploring whether the Russian security framework could be extended to include Emirati interests. Qatar, which hosts the largest American military base in the region at Al Udeid, but also maintains a working relationship with Iran, finds itself in familiar territory, balanced uncomfortably between competing power centers. Bahrain, which hosts the U.S. Fifth Fleet and is deeply dependent on Saudi security guarantees, is the most alarmed of the Gulf states, viewing the Russian deal as a potential precursor to a Saudi strategic reorientation that would leave Bahrain exposed. Kuwait and Oman are watching and waiting, calculating which way the wind is blowing before committing to a position. In European capitals, the concern is both strategic and economic, and it is sharpening by the hour. A Russian-brokered Gulf security architecture that includes energy price coordination threatens European energy security by giving Moscow additional leverage over global oil markets, leverage that Europe has spent 4 years and hundreds of billions of euros trying to reduce since the Ukraine invasion. The irony is suffocating. Europe sanctioned Russia to reduce Moscow's energy leverage. Europe built LNG terminals and signed long-term contracts with Gulf producers, specifically to diversify away from Russian gas. And Russia responded by building an energy alliance with the very producers that Europe turned to as alternatives, an alliance that gives Moscow indirect influence over the price and availability of the energy that Europe now depends on as a substitute for the Russian energy it abandoned. The European Commission has reportedly convened an emergency energy security review, but the options available are limited. Europe cannot sanction Saudi Arabia. Europe cannot sanction the OPEC Plus framework. Europe can only watch as the architecture it built to contain Russian energy leverage is being outflanked by a Russian diplomatic maneuver that it did not anticipate and cannot counter without undermining its own energy security. In New Delhi, the reaction has been one of strategic alertness. India maintains significant defense ties with Russia, a complex relationship with Iran centered on the Chabahar port, and a growing strategic partnership with Saudi Arabia that includes energy imports and labor migration. The Russian brokered deal does not directly threaten Indian interests, but it creates a power block in the Gulf that India has no seat in and no influence over. And any energy coordination mechanism that affects global oil prices directly impacts India's import bill, currently the third largest in the world. Indian strategic planners are reportedly assessing whether the deal creates an opening for India to deepen its own Gulf security role, or whether it represents a consolidation of power among actors whose interests may not align with New Delhi's. The lessons from this deal are already being absorbed into the strategic calculus of every major power, and they cut deep. First, the United States lost the Middle East not through military defeat, but through diplomatic negligence. Washington spent 50 years providing Saudi Arabia with weapons, bases, and security guarantees while attaching conditions that Riyadh found increasingly intolerable. Congressional reviews, human rights certifications, arms sale delays driven by domestic politics, and the ever-present threat that a new administration would rewrite the terms of the relationship. Russia offered the same security product without the conditions. The market spoke. Second, Russia has demonstrated that a nation under Western sanctions, fighting a war in Ukraine and operating with a GDP smaller than Italy's, can still reshape the global order if it identifies and exploits the right leverage points. Moscow did not outspend the United States in the Gulf. It did not outgun the United States. It outmaneuvered the United States by offering something America's political system is structurally incapable of providing: unconditional partnership. Third, the post-Cold War assumption that the United States is the indispensable nation in Middle Eastern diplomacy is finished. China brokered a deal in 2023. Russia brokered a deeper one in 2026. The trend is not ambiguous. The Middle East is developing its own diplomatic infrastructure, and that infrastructure increasingly runs through Moscow and Beijing rather than Washington. Fourth, the energy weapon has been transformed. OPEC Plus was already a powerful coordination mechanism. A Russian, Iranian, Saudi energy framework operating within OPEC Plus elevates it from a price management tool to a geopolitical instrument capable of rewarding allies and punishing adversaries through production decisions that affect every economy on Earth. The United States is energy independent. Its allies in Europe and Asia are not. The vulnerability is not American. It is structural, embedded in the energy dependence of the alliance network that American power depends on. Fifth, the deal reveals the fatal weakness of conditional alliances. The United States offered Saudi Arabia the most powerful military partnership on Earth, but it came with strings: congressional oversight, human rights conditions, election cycle volatility, and the ever-present risk that domestic politics would override strategic commitments. Russia offered a partnership that is smaller in scale, but unconditional in nature. And in the brutal marketplace of geopolitical survival, unconditional beats powerful every single time. Nations do not choose their partners based on who is strongest. They choose based on who is most reliable. Moscow understood this. Washington did not. The old Middle East, the Middle East managed by American carriers, American diplomats, American arms sales, and American permission, is not dying. It is being replaced methodically and deliberately by a new architecture in which Russia sits at the center of the table, Iran sits at the table as a legitimate participant rather than a pariah, and Saudi Arabia sits at the table as a sovereign actor choosing its own partners rather than a client state accepting the partners Washington assigns. Nobody in Washington saw this coming. And that blindness, that institutional inability to imagine a Middle East that does not revolve around American power, is the most damning verdict of all. Stay vigilant, stay informed. What do you think? Is this deal the beginning of a genuine Middle Eastern peace, or is it the most elaborate Russian trap since the Cold War? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. If this analysis opened your eyes, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a briefing. Until next time, stay sharp.